Ladies and gentlemen, up next is the most important part of today's event. It is the reason why we are all here, the governance diagnostic report that is being released. And ladies and gentlemen, to present the findings on this governance diagnostic report, I cordially invite onto the stage Professor Arjuna Parakrama. He is a scholar and activist, and over the last 40 years, he has a distinguished academic career, including former visiting fellowships at the Columbia University, New York, the University of Pittsburgh, USA, La Trobe University in Australia, the US Institute of Peace, the Carnegie Council of Ethics and International Affairs, and the National University of Malaysia, as well as shorter teaching and research assignments in India and Nepal. He was a Fulbright New Century Scholar in 2007, 2008. He's also a global expert on human rights-based approach in development and on conflict transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome please accord a warm welcome, of course, to Professor Arjuna Parakrama, who will be presenting the findings on the governance diagnostic report.
Good morning to all of you. I'm going to present the findings, the conclusions, and the ways forward as we see it on the basis of this study that we have done. Without much ado, let me get to the report itself. So first, the background and the context. As you know, this is the worst post-independence economic crisis. We have intense hardships, unprecedented people's uprising, as have been pointed out. And the key public platforms on this which was based were fighting corruption and nepotism, demanding accountability. There has also been, it's sad to note, a shrinking civic space and a crisis of legitimacy. I will not go into the details, but I think that's fairly clear. We have also the signs, very clear signs, of impunity leading to state capture, which need to be addressed. May 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt for the first time in its history. And in March 2023, the IMF approved a 2.9 billion EFF for the 17th time. So we have lots of first and 17 times. The current IMF program includes governance and anti-corruption pillar for the first time in Asia. So this is also an opportunity for us to engage with this issue for the first time and be an example, a clear example not only to Asia but also across the board in IMF diagnostics. But I think the key issue is the last one here, that there is an overall perception that the initial reforms, as they have been done now, burden the poor, not the culprits. So the question is, there is an unequal responsibility borne by the people who are not responsible for the crisis, whereas those who are responsible sort of remain relatively unscathed. So this is the methodology. We had extensive consultations across the country, 9 focus group discussions, 250 odd people, which were not first-time meetings. They were meetings based on trust and understanding that was built up across the years with all the groups and the associations that the core group and others had. And this sort of ensured in some way a sectoral, geographical, ethnic, religious, and ideological, demographical thing. So we had people who represented different areas in the spectrum of ideology, economic, political, social, and so on. So then we had the overall guidance of the core group and a validation meeting with multiple revisions and teamwork. I want to underscore the fact that this is teamwork. All of us have put something into this, and we hope that that ownership will become crucial. What is the type of report that we have produced? I think that's important to say at the outset. This is a strictly evidence-based report which balances research with public experiential insights and ownership. So it's something that's very carefully and meticulously documented. So it's not, this then needs to lead to advocacy. It needs to lead to, it's not a report that is in itself an advocacy document, but it should lead to that. It's very carefully researched, as I said, and documented, and everyone has contributed to that. It targets policy intervention and public interest advocacy. The methodology, as I've said, the types and sources of information. We have used 5 types of information. We use relevant national studies, reports, summaries, key informant interviews. This was the core and the heart of much of the work. And then the 9 focus group discussions across the country. If that's the heart, this was actually the body of it. The body of it being the responses that people gave us from all walks of life. Then we did regional comparative studies and analyses, related legislation and documents, and then we went to more journalistic and public-oriented pieces on the governance corruption nexus, because this has to be both private, both public and intellectually solid. So we looked also at the relevant IMF documents, country reports in the region and elsewhere as relevant. So now let me identify some key concerns, and I apologize, it's a bit of a long slide because we had issues in terms of formatting. So first is the entrenched corruption and state capture has weakened the accountability framework. So we are not starting from ground zero, we're starting from a minus place that we have to build up. So there is the accountability framework, the state and private mass media is manipulated, civil society repressed, the misuse, we can say abuse of state-owned enterprises, interfere with public procurement and with public officials. So the question then that we ask is, how will reforms addressing these very issues fare without a system change, as has been pointed out? So it's a chicken and the egg thing. These are the things we want to change, the report says, and these are the very things that entrenches a regime and a system that is corrupt and abusive. So the question then that we have to ask is the government committed, or how committed is the government and its partners, in this case, for the planned reforms that we need to go well beyond the IMF agreement? I mean, this is important. We are writing a report at this stage, but it's not a 2-year or even a 4-year kind of horizon. This goes well beyond that. Is there the political will and the implementation mechanisms which should be instrumental, will not be instrumental, but be holistic? So we are not talking about one reform because it's dictated and another one there, while at the same time there are other counter reforms in the wings, as we said. While there are many long overdue and laudable laws which have been brought, we say perhaps at the IMF suggestion or at their nudging, many other draconian laws are still either in place, like the PTA, others are in the wings, such as the proposed Anti-Terrorism Act, the Broadcast Bill, the NGO Bill, and yet others are selectively misused, like the ICCPR Act, which is used only to target certain kinds of people. So that's the context we have. We should not go overboard with the fact that some good legislation is coming up, because this other stuff is always there. So as in the past, implementation, which should be impartial, efficient, economical, transparent, and accountable, it needs to be monitored and it needs to be made public. So let me now move to the proposals, having done the background. We devised 3 organizing principles for these governance benchmarks. These are the benchmarks. The first is the immediate, in the sense that measures that enhance the transparency and accountability of existing systems that are necessary to produce the required fiscal and governance outcomes. So that's clear. That's the here and the now, what's not been followed properly, what needs to be made more transparent, more accountable in the current. The second are measures to improve macro political economic stability and sustainability. And note, it's political economic, not merely economic, because the governance benchmarks that we have go beyond the narrowly economistic. And then the third is measures towards structural change. So the second one would be, if existing legislation is inadequate, these are the things that are required to bridge that gap. And the third will go furthest, and that is measures towards structural changes that are necessary to significantly reduce corruption, risk, and impunity. Those require changes. So those are the longer term. So maps clearly on the immediate being the first 6 months. That's the first category. The second would be up to 1 year, and we are using the IMF terms as well that they have used, and then the next is up to 2 years. So this now is a kind of organization, as it were, of how the recommendations, there are 34 recommendations, and this is how we have organized them and structured them. I know I will go through all of them in some respect, but I think it's important to get the overview, as we said, needs to be seen holistically, not to cherry pick 1, 2, or 3, because they seem to be appropriate and easy. So the first we have is an overarching and foundational recommendation, which is immediate. Then we have tax reform, revenue collection, and expenditure control, which are 13 recommendations, 9 of which are immediate, and 4 within 1 year, what we call medium term. Then procurement, 3 recommendations, 1 is immediate and 2 within 1 year. We have asset declaration, 1 which is immediate. Deterrence against corruption, including prosecution, 8 governance benchmarks. 3 are immediate, 2 within 1 year, and 2 within 2 years. Environmental protection, 1 which is immediate. Democratic legitimacy, establishing the mandate, which is lacking, as we said, we have a crisis of legitimacy. We have 4 recommendations, 2 immediate, 1 within 1 year, and 1 within 2 years. Reduction of unnecessary expense, 1 which is immediate. And social inclusion, the safety net, 2, 1 within 1 year, and 1 within 2 years. So that's the overview. Now, I know it may not be of great interest to all, but let me go through each of these so that we have some kind of understanding of what we are addressing and where we are. Right. So now let's look at the first set. That the first one is the overarching foundation, which we have put as recommendation 18, because it needs to come, it needs to be there to guide the others, but we are clear that some other recommendations need to be in place as well. So there, what we have is, we need to protect and uphold civic space and fundamental rights. This is seen as a very high priority. I'll do an analysis later, but let's understand that. So then we move to the second set, which relates to tax reform, revenue collection, expenditure control. And in that, if we look at the tax exemptions, we have 6 recommendations there. I'll scroll down, but at the moment, so yeah, so those expenditure, the tax exemptions, yeah, so the exemptions, first is to maintain a physical transparency platform that displays all information related to tax exemptions. In many cases, we found that if there is information, it's hidden, it's inaccessible, it's deliberately disinforming, it's misleading, it's partial. So I think part of the heart of it, it's not really hard, but there has to be political commitment, because that exposes the people who are responsible. So in many cases, you'll notice that we have asked for public access, not things that you have to go and apply and so on. So it will be public online access, which is clear and transparent, and so that where there is no gap between what is the law and its implementation. So this can be seen. So there we have 6 sub-recommendations about the transparency platform, and in terms of the longer term there, the up to 12 months, we are talking about we need to amend all tax exemptions. So you notice, so we have a list of the exemptions. Then when that's wrong, the next one is the policy change to address that. As you know, there are some exemptions which are birth to death. Some companies, some organizations have never been taxed and will not be taxed. Some of them are taxed unequally. Okay, so amend those things, because there is an excessive discretion. This is what leads to corruption. This is what corruption is. So we need to remove that. Then, for example, tobacco tax. We are very clear that there is a great loss of revenue there, and that needs to be sorted out immediately. Then we are looking at, and it's reasonable, an annual reduction of 10% in tax exemptions. So that we are not asking for it to be done overnight, but 10% needs to be done in the first 12 months to show the bona fides and the kind of the fact that there is that political will by the state. So we move from there. So those are only medium and long term. Yeah, so then we look at the next stage, which relates to expenditure. We have excuse me, we have three immediate demands there: publishing the annual report, setting out expenditure variation against approved budget. This, I think, is very important. Expenditure variation. People will say that you can get it at the budget and so on, but expenditure variation, so that people know what is budgeted and what has been spent, and that has to be transparent and accountable. I think the key thing is that the systems need to be placed, they need to be accessible by the people, non-economists like me and others. So then the quarterly expenditure reports, limiting the budget allocation under development activities of the Department of National Budget to 3% of total expenditure. So expenditure controls need to be very clear, and they need to be accountable. So we look at then the next one, the question of audit and debt. So there we have more immediate ones and one longer term. I think the longer term one, I'm sorry. Yes. So there we have the Auditor General's report, follow-up action. The reports are there and they become just observed in the breach. So we require follow-up action to be regularized, to be clear. Then the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which I think is very important. It's an old act, but it's observed in the breach entirely, and there are 3 sub-recommendations on that. Then, of course, compliance with the Right to Information Act and the publishing of quarterly information on public debt. These need to be transparent and accountable. They can't be secrets in government. I think the important thing that we have done for the medium term is to set up the recommendation to set up a public debt management office external to the central bank. I think this is crucial, because that is where you can't have a whole set of conflicts of interest aside from politicization involved in a place that needs to be impartial, and we are discussing a separate section on conflict of interest. So I think it's important to see that. Yes. Then we come to the very vexed question, which is very public and very clear, about the domestic debt reconstruction, not optimization, and its relation to the EPF. So we think that there are 3 recommendations there in terms of the conflict of interest involved, in terms of a sort of very sort of unique and interesting application of the pari passu principle as regards domestic debt in terms of seeing equality across the board, and to sort of identify the secondary market transactions of the EPF across the board. When we say the country has lost money in various scams, it's the EPF that has lost, which means the ordinary people have lost that money. So I think that sums up our list in terms of the tax reform, revenue collection, expenditure. And now we move to another really crucial issue, procurement. There we have 3 recommendations, 1 immediate and 2 medium term. We need to have a public, you notice the emphasis over and over again is public accessible platform that identifies all significant public procurement contracts which are over 100 million rupees. So I think that needs to be necessary, it needs to be public. Then we need to strengthen the National Procurement Commission on the medium term, particularly in terms of its oversight on unsolicited proposals, so you have to pass those, because we know that's where most of the corruption takes place, that in the unsolicited and emergency area. Right. Then we are saying, this is not too much, we're saying we need at least 10 audits of 10 state ministries where competitive bidding is over 10 billion in terms of procurement. So that there is a progressive kind of thing. We are hoping to make the systems clearer. That's where you move to a system change. Not immediately, but you move towards that. Right. Then asset declarations. We are saying that the Anti-Corruption Act needs to be implemented in that case, because asset declarations, as you know, are there, but they are secret and they can't be, there's an entire story around that which needs to be sorted out. Now we move to a new category, which is deterrence against corruption, including prosecution. There are 8 proposals in all, 3 which are immediate, 3 which are short term, and 2 which are longer term. So we need to reduce corruption and waste in relation to benefits of political leaders. In fact, the one sub-recommendation we have there is a very simple thing, but none is about the use of vehicles, use and abuse of vehicles, and how they stand in terms of that. We are saying publish that. Right? We don't know how many and so on and all of that. So that then we are looking at politicization of the public service. This is indeed a tragedy, and we need to be able to see measures in revoking that. And then we also have CEOBOC, and we are talking about, there's a very detailed recommendation on CEOBOC's readiness to investigate. What does it investigate? How does it investigate it? And so on. Then in terms of the short term, up to 12 months, they have a conflict of interest register. I think this is very important, and this is a good example, best practice elsewhere. And there are 3 sub-recommendations there. This conflict of interest does not seem to be a concept that we are either familiar or comfortable with in this country. So I think we need to be able to bring that onto the table. Then we have the management of the state enterprises. These seem to be at the moment like the public, the public property or the private property of certain public people. So that I think needs to be sorted out. Then we talk about the illicit financial flows. These are very important, and we need to see the IFFs. We need to see control of that. Then, of course, in the longer term, in the 24-month horizon, we are talking about the asset recovery, the stolen asset recovery. This is crucial. And then we're talking about an independent public prosecutor's office. This has been a very long demand. As you know, the Attorney General's Department functions as an organ of the government, not even the state. And that becomes extremely problematic, and we are asking for that. So then the next one is very clear, environmental protection. We need again that to be public and aware. We don't know where it is and where it happens and so on. Then we move to the question of democratic legitimacy. This is the key issue for any reforms to be owned and understood and practiced. And there we are saying in the immediate term, elections must be held. That's the first point. Elections must be held, and there are 2 sub-recommendations on that. And we also need that the election campaign expenditure need to be monitored. In terms of the second subsection on these elections, we're saying the election commission needs to be financially independent. So that can ensure. Then we are saying fairly simple. So we have mixed, simple, straightforward things, but nonetheless important ones. The medium term is parliamentary standing orders to better reflect continuity and accountability. Every time there's a prorogation, then all the committees get dissolved, and then it's a way of disturbing and manipulating the business of Parliament. Then 34, which is our last recommendation, we talk about the Constitutional Council. This is a longer term thing. Needs to be more reflective of society, civil society, needs to be more public, and it needs to be more engaged in other work. Right now it is still in the capture of the political class. So unnecessary divisive expenditure, this I think, aside from its political and social importance, we are presenting this as also an economic issue, the sort of demilitarization, particularly of the North and the East, and the cutting of the military expenditure. I think this is crucial, and we have explained that. So because it is, and I will discuss that later, it is clearly a political issue, it's an issue of ethics and morality, but we are presenting it here because the IMF will say perhaps that they are their mandate is only in terms of economic. So we are suggesting the other governance issues in this economic waste. Right. So we move then to the final section. In many ways, the hardest and the most publicly spoken about, the social inclusion safety net and protection of the most vulnerable. I think this is something that we have had a relatively proud history in the past of protecting those who are vulnerable. So we'd go through a 30-year war and still not have the kind of levels of poverty and starvation that we have now. And I think that's an extremely sad and terrible predicament. So we are suggesting in the medium term that the new, the new safety net cash transfer thing needs to be more transparent, more accountable, more open, And I think we need to rethink that. While we agree that multidimensional poverty is much more important and correct and accurate than mere financial things, we believe that aspects of that, like illness and debility and so on, needs to be universal. The coverage for that needs to be universal. If somebody has chronic kidney disease or thalassemia or something, that coverage needs to be the targeting and the financial thing, yes, but that needs to be more countable and transparent. Then, of course, we have the issue of the Malaya Tamil population, and we are suggesting that both land and workers' rights need to be enshrined and need to be thought of in any serious engagement with the national polity. So basically now I'm going to analyze a bit, and thank you for your patience. I'm looking at, in terms of the public discussion that we had across the country, these are the highest public priority benchmarks. Right. The strong gender consensus for protecting civic space and fundamental rights. That's our 8th proposal. That is very clear, very strongly felt, and universal across the board. From Jaffna to Matara and everywhere in between where we went, this is clear. The second is the holding of national elections in time. This is not in any particular order. The national election time, this is number 4 too. That was also very clear across the board, even in areas traditionally who are quite disparaging of elections. They still feel that that is very important, that legitimacy is important. Then the third, safeguarding the EPF and other superannuation funds, including from targeted domestic debt reconstruction. I think that is also very clear and felt across the board in the plantation areas, in Ampara and so on, wherever we went to discuss it. Then the fourth is reducing corruption and waste in benefits to politicians and bureaucrats. This is felt. The disparity is felt. How people suffer, and they see people traveling in 5 and 6 cars, and we don't know where they are, and people don't give it back, and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's extremely important. So if we continue, right, we also say establish an independent corruption prosecution office. A public prosecution office, I think, is also seen right across the board, because they see the Attorney General's department as a lackey of the government and not as somebody independent. So therefore, it's extremely difficult, coupled with the other scandals that we've had. Increasing transparency of new social safety net, again seen as crucial. And of course, last but clearly not least, the expediting of stolen asset recovery. This needs to be fundamental. Now, if you look at the specific groups, not only them, but by and large, these are non-negotiable sort of game-changing principles would be the demilitarization of North and the East, reduction of military expenditure that you can clearly see comes from North and the East, and other areas. So it's not only there, but it is basically, as I say, if we think you are legitimate, if you think you are bona fide, if we think that you are serious, then this is something you need to do, because you've not done it. Of course, the housing and livelihood protection for Malaya Tamil community. So that's, I think, the set of priorities from the public point of view, very strongly held, and an active citizenry which is no longer passively going to wait years and years and years and years till they get an election, if they do. So, yes. Now the question, the final thing, as we said, the devil in the detail or in the implementation. So assessment of results, accountability mechanisms. There's a universal comment across, both in the key informant interviews as well as in the focus group discussions and in the literature. Implementation of the recommendations must be independently monitored, progress must be measured, and accountability assessed. The monitoring and evaluation framework must be for each governance benchmark, not an overall thing. There must be a monitoring and evaluation framework for each government benchmark. The monitoring and evaluation of progress should involve the active and equal participation of appropriate civil society entities to ensure that targets are met and goals remain in sight. The actual mechanism needs to be discussed, and you need to be very careful, but I think these 3 principles are very clear. Without this, we will only have words on the page, we will have promises, or we will have partially, selectively implemented good stuff and lots of bad stuff threatening us in the wings. So that's all I have to say, and I'm happy and privileged to be here. I think there will be space in more informal context for discussion of this, and I know the members of the core group will also contribute. I hope I haven't gone over time. Thank you very much.